Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrew Reinertz. I'm the Community Development Director with Arts South Dakota, and really excited to have you all here today with our panel of panelists. Really great trio of folks to talk to with some really wonderful experience on both sides of both reviewing grants as panelists and having written grants themselves. It's also really great to see a lot of familiar names, no faces, of course, but familiar names in the attendee list, and really excited to see so many of you here with us on a sunny, almost warm February day. There's a little hope for spring coming, I think. But before we get started, just wanted to first of all thank our partners, without whom we couldn't do any of these professional development activities. In particular, funding from the South Dakota Arts Council, the Bush Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, as well as the many arts supporters, member organizations, individual donors to Arts South Dakota from around the state. We really couldn't do this without all of your support. Also, as we get a little bit into the process here, we'll be having a nice kind of freewheeling conversation with the panelists. But please, if you have any questions to ask, use the Q&A button in Zoom. It really helps us to be able to keep everything organized. And then the chat function should be open for everyone. And please feel free to say hello to the panelists, say hello to each other, and ask any technical questions you might have if you're having trouble with Zoom. Also wanted to make note that we have a couple of other really helpful webinars coming up. Allison Morgan of Prints and Repeat Fine Art Printing here in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. We'll be doing kind of a Taking Photos of Your Artwork 101. She does a lot of really high quality archival print scanning and print making for artists, but has a lot of really good tips and tricks for just kind of trying to get the best simple photography of your two-dimensional and three-dimensional art pieces for online galleries, for grant submissions, for other usage. And then also we were just able to schedule for Thursday, April 6th. One of the trainers from the South Dakota Department of Revenue will be able to join us to talk through South Dakota sales tax for both artists and performers. As many of you know, there are a lot of interesting complications in South Dakota with tax that is due by artists and performers for goods and services sold. And so we're really excited to be able to have them join us to help talk through a lot of the myriad of bureaucratic paperwork that we all have to do as creative entrepreneurs and creative business owners. So to kind of set the stage before I introduce our panelists, I just wanted to kind of walk through what a panel often looks like. So every organization is different as far as whether it's the State Arts Council, whether it's a private family foundation, but for the most part, granting organizations will have panels set up to review the hundreds in many cases of grants that they receive. So what that means is that the staff is there to help usher you through the process, but they're not really the ones making the final decisions. It's really the panelists of other folks in the field, sometimes outside the field, that really do the reviewing. And so it creates an interesting challenge because you don't even know who the panel is going to be. You don't have a relationship with them. They have no knowledge of you, your past work, your place in the state, your geography. You know, when we often say, hey, you know, as everyone knows, in the Northeast, so-and-so is the case with our geography. They have no idea. So, you know, you need to just really keep a lot of this in mind. And so we thought it would be an interesting idea to have three individuals that have both written grants but also served as grant panelists on various organizations come to have a little bit of a conversation about what's been helpful to them as they've been reviewing, in many cases, you know, dozens and dozens of grants. What helps them really understand best what you're trying to do? So I'd like to have our panelists introduce themselves, and first I'll start with my colleague Jim Spears from Arts South Dakota.
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, Jim Spears. I am the executive director of Arts South Dakota, and this is a new experience for me being on the panel. Normally, I'm just watching or sometimes introducing alongside Andrew. So I'm excited to be part of this. And yes, I've had several experiences both as a panelist reviewing grants And obviously, as a nonprofit administrator and an artist myself, a musician, I've done plenty of grant writing. So I've seen kind of both sides. And it's just kind of a reality of the work we do. This is a part of it. And so I'm glad we can talk about our experiences and hopefully help everyone attending today with some maybe tips and tricks.
Great, thanks, Jim. And now I'll pass it up to Jane up in Sisseton.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jane Rasmussen. I'm the director of the Sisseton Arts Council. And I also serve on the board of the South Dakota Arts Council. I've done both of those for maybe more years than I care to acknowledge. But in doing so, I realized that it has involved a lot of grant writing, and then serving on the State Arts Council. I've been part of the panel process for a number of years, and then along the way, I've also had the chance to review grants for other nonprofits, and of course, write grants to on behalf of the Arts Council and I'm involved with the two museums in Sisseton, the Stavik House Museum and the Nicolay Tower and Interpretive Center. So along the lines of arts and culture and history grants. So yeah, so I'm pleased to be here. I hope I can provide you with something helpful.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Jane, for being here. I'm going to see. I'm just my dog saw either the squirrel or the mailman, and so I'm just waiting for the next bark. I was trying to time my unmuting well there, but I'll pass it over to my good friend Brian Bieber.
Hey everyone, I'm Brian Bieber. I am a creative director and copywriter by day, and I'm also a writer and a filmmaker when I'm applying for grants. And yeah, so I've applied for and received multiple grants from different organizations in South Dakota and Minnesota, and have also been on multiple panels as well. And so both. And that process was extremely helpful to me in getting better at writing grants. So I'm excited that we have this opportunity to talk about it.
Well, as I kind of set up at the beginning, just a reminder that not only is it not the staff, but many times it's even folks out of state. So Jim, for instance, you served on some panels both for the NEA and the Nebraska Arts Council, was it? So when you're really dealing with either a new organization, whether it's new to the state, or just you're dealing with a state that you have no context with, what are some of the things that really jumped out as you as a panelist there of really getting to the meat of what the organization does and kind of explaining their organizational history, whether that's in the narrative or in some of the responses, because oftentimes we're writing these grants for a specific project, but you're trying to really set up who you are as an organization. What have you found there?
Yeah, that's a good question. There are a couple things. One, when I've served, especially out of state, I've done some in-state panels, but the ones that that question was focusing on the out-of-state panels, where I really have no knowledge. I remember first getting a packet of applications and digging in, and really there was just no reference points for me. So in that scenario, I think having a tidy organizational summary, if you haven't sat down to consider how do you tell a little background about your organization, a little history in just a few sentences, that's something to work on. Of course, when you sit down with someone and talk about it, or you're maybe writing the history for or your information for a mission statement or something, those are all unique goals. But for a grant, I think it needs to really come down to just a few sentences that can tell the reader what you do, why you do it. And then the other point I think that I found especially helpful are the grants that would get right into the project they're applying for within the first couple sentences. One of the experiences I had reading grants involved reading 40 of them. And I'll tell you what, if the first sentence of the narrative, the first few sentences talk about the project, get me as the reader excited about that project, I'll tell you what, I felt like I was more in tune, more focused through the reading of the rest of the grant versus having to read through a long narrative and a bunch of background information. And it's not till you're almost to the end that the narrative starts to talk about the project. And sometimes by then, right or wrong, it was probably my fault. Maybe I'm reading one too late at night or something to that, like that. But I would find that I had a harder time staying focused and really towards the end of the grant, understanding what I was reading about, understanding what it was about. So, yeah, I think that's very important to be tidy, get into the project right at the beginning, and make sure you excite your reader. Obviously, as a grant writer and as an organizational leader, you're excited about the project. So share that excitement. Let that come through in your writing, and get to it right away so that the reader can get excited and kind of join your interest right from the start.
Yeah, that's really, really helpful. And also a helpful reminder that, for instance, Jim, when you reviewed the NEA grants, how many did you have to read? It was 40 some,
plus, yep.
Yeah, 40 to 50.
Plus.
And so no matter what, it's kind of like a high school social studies teacher. At a certain point, it gets real hard to read every single word of every single essay if you're a teacher, and so trying to be as concise, which I know is difficult because from personal experience, you've got a lot of information to try to pack into these things, which kind of brings me, Brian. So not only as a panelist, not only as a grant writer yourself, but also your kind of professional life is as a writer and as a copywriter. We spoke a little bit about the organizational summary, but I'm kind of putting you on the spot because this wasn't something I had prepped for you before. But what might be some tips if you're more of an individual artist? Is it any different than an organization really talking about what their work and what their mission statements is, or is it similar?
Yeah, I think it's very similar. As Jim was talking, I related to that very strongly. I think in the early grants that I wrote, I was concerned about creating context before explaining the project, and I think you need to flip that and treat it almost like news writing, where you have your headline, and then your lead paragraph, and then you provide more and more context. So you want people to get excited about your project, and then when they start asking questions about details to themselves, then they get those answers as they read. If that makes sense. So you don't get, if you're reading, an article in the newspaper, you don't get a bunch of history or context until a few paragraphs down. And I think it's the same with the grant. You kind of want to hit them with what the project is, what the goal is right up front, like what you're going to use the money for, and then create context around that. If that makes sense.
Yeah, that does, and that's really helpful. I know, honestly, I'm like, okay, well, now I'm changing my next narrative. That's because I know I'm so much of a wordy, I want to answer everyone's questions before they have them. But I like that idea of, no, here's what we're doing, and now I'll provide the context and still answer your questions. But I kind of try almost too hard to anticipate before providing the information, So that's really helpful to think of it like news. Gene, you've done so many grants to so many different types of foundations and sat on so many different types of panels. What else have you found really helpful in the narratives? We've been talking about this kind of tidy organizational summary and kind of a little bit of how to structure, but are there any things you've noticed that have either thrown you off or been incredibly helpful as you've been reading through these project narratives?
Well, I can relate a lot to both of what Brian and Jim mentioned. And I think, yes, one thing that makes it hard, like you said, Jim, when you have a lot of applications, if you find like there's a question about how are you going to evaluate the project, and you're reading along, and then if you have to backtrack and go, wait, now, did they talk about how they were going to evaluate it? And so all of a sudden you're kind of reading it all again to look for answers, and that can be problematic. So I think one of the things that's helpful is just if this is allowed, I know sometimes you're just filling in on a kind of an online application and they don't let you boldface or bullet, but if you are able to do any of that in a narrative, it really helps the reader. If it talks about what's the need for this project, if you can boldface the need is, or rephrase something to so that you're keeping the reader with the criteria of the grant, that's really helpful. And I think along with that idea of jumping right into it, sometimes leaving the reader with something visual, or it might be a quote, it might be a really short story of the impact of what it is that you want to do. If you're writing about something for students, it's going to benefit students, and you can relate one little nugget of a story. Those things really can help just put a face on what the project is. And I think the other thing you have to remember is that, a panelist is reading a lot of grants, scoring them, commenting on them, and then it might still be a week or 10 days before the panel meets, and then you need to do recall of being able to discuss all those. So whatever the writer can do to make it, memorable. I think bold writing is something with energy in it is really, you can feel that. You can feel the energy. And sometimes you can feel when things just drift along or seem vague. So that, keeping that sharp focus.
Yeah, that's really helpful. One thing I was going to mention in there is for individual artists, I think we're often very Midwestern, and we're very aw shucks. I guess I'm okay, but I think what you were mentioning about telling that story of the impact, when you're an arts organization that's doing educational outreach, for instance, you've got so many of these really wonderful, you feel like you can be the cheerleader for the organization. And I think when you're an individual artist, you're the cheerleader for yourself, and it can feel odd to do that. But I think just embrace that and just say, if this is going to be a transformative opportunity for you and your work, say it. Say how this will impact you, almost like you're the arts organization supporting you as an artist in your work. Sometimes getting that kind of third person view for a minute as an individual can help me think, okay, it's not me just saying, okay, I'm an artist, I need money, but it's like, no, this is really transformative for me, and my artwork has impact in my community, and I want to be able to further increase that reach.
I would add to that too. I think you can, as an individual, I don't know what you're talking about, Andrew. I'm very comfortable talking about how great I am all the time. We both went to Catholic school, so we know this. But I think if you're feeling that sort of imposter syndrome or whatever, reaching out to the people for letters of support isn't just a way. That can also be can sort of elevate your own esteem a little bit, and that is a way to get a third party to say nice things about you, that are true. But that, I think that can kind of help like pump up your confidence as well. If you look at what someone, the way people look at us and our art is a lot different than the way we look at it sometimes, and I think we can't see as clearly as those third parties. So if you can get those letters of support early on, that can influence the way you approach your narrative as well.
Yeah, that's all really fantastic points and tips. So I wanted to jump back. That made me think of I'm gonna hold on. There's so many good options of where to go next, and so I'm just kind of trying to not lose my own thread here. But speaking of that idea of getting some outside letters of support, one thing that I know many of us know, but I'm just as guilty of everyone as neglecting to actually do it. But it can be really helpful to have folks outside of your organization but if you're an artist, folks outside of your field completely read your grant and help you edit your grant narrative, because then they're the ones that are able to say, I have no, you're using technical terms that I have no idea what this means. If you're, I'm not a visual artist, I'm a musician, and there are many times reading through sculptural narratives, for instance, where I'm like, that sounds amazing, but this kind of feels like reading Greek to me. And so, being able to have someone say, I think I could use a little more help with this, or a little more help with understanding that. And then Jim, you and I have talked about this before, but along those same lines, not only do they not know about you, but if they don't know about the region, they might not know why you qualify for something. So for instance, if it's a rural focused grant where it's, you have to be from a rural community or some other specific criteria, they might not know why you even qualify. Can you speak to some of that from your experience?
Yeah, there's two very vivid examples for me. One is from many, many years ago when I served on the South Dakota Arts Council with Jane. Back when I think you were even relatively new on the council. But I remember getting advice on one of the panels. We were reviewing a grant application, and I happened to know the artist and knew that this person was definitely fully capable and in a great project to fund, just a really stand-up artist, but it wasn't clearly spelled out in the application. And I remember a seasoned panelist that was serving with me explaining in one of my very first South Dakota Arts Council panels that you need to base your scores on what's in the grant. It's so easy in a place like South Dakota because, we are tight knit. We often know each other, especially in the rather small circle of artists, that it's very easy to go, well, so-and-so didn't spell that out in the grant, but I know they can do that. I just know their work. Well, that's really not what you're evaluating. And that was an early lesson, even though this person, we were looking at the grant, I knew full well what they were capable of. It wasn't spelled out in the grant, and that's problematic. Another example, and this is maybe more to your point, Andrew, is I was reviewing grants across a national grant panel. So we were looking at organizations across the country, and the grants were specifically designed to fund projects for underserved populations. And I remember reading several of the applications and just not having a clue how they related to the underserved population. It was not spelled out, and me not being from that location, not being able to say, oh, that geography or that work, that whatever that would define the fact that they were serving under an underserved population. If that's not spelled out in the grant, you're kind of left wondering, does this really serve that population? And that's what this funding is for. So immediately, even if the rest of the grant was really well written and the project was exciting and everything about it seemed A+, if that underserved population component wasn't clearly defined, I gave it a lower score, because that was clearly one of the criteria we were supposed to evaluate. So if there are, if it's an underserved population, or it's rural, or it's traditional arts, or anything that would be a definition as part of the criteria, make sure you address how your work fits that definition. And I think we get so wrapped up in our work. Sometimes we just forget that, that someone reviewing this that's not from my area, not ever been part of my project or heard of my work, isn't going to necessarily be able to deduce that on their own. That, that they're not familiar with the with the local knowledge, if you will. So don't count on local knowledge, you know, especially in South Dakota. It's easy for us to forget that because we're just so used to people kind of knowing all about us and each other. And so it's we spell it out, you know, and define it and make sure that if that's a specific criteria that you address that directly. Use the word underserved population, use the word rural. Here's why we fit that criteria. Make it really obvious, you know. Because it's easy to miss if you're reading 40 of those and you're not in they're from across the country, right?
And I think usually if it is NEA money, then things like underserved and rural are going to come up in most of the applications that you're dealing with. And
You're
so
right.
I think again, they're spending some time creating some kind of a really solid summary of your organization that includes those things that will fit you well when you're applying for grants. And if you're not real sure about what some of those terms mean, again, just turn to the staff at the South Dakota Arts Council, because I'm sure we'll talk more and more about that. But you know, they really are there to answer those questions and to help fill in the gaps of things. You don't have to pretend like you know everything about grant writing just because you happen to be the person writing the grant. And there's just, you know, so many resources and so much good help there. So I can't say that enough, that's a good place to turn, and that any question like that is, you know, we'll get a response.
And
Sometimes we just need to know, what is the definition of rural, or what is the definition of underserved? What are the things that I should be talking about there?
And I would echo that, Jane, on every panel that I've served on, not just South Dakota Arts Council, but I think that's a kind of a unanimous or pretty typical response, whether it's NEA or the Nebraska Arts Council or Propel Nonprofit. Some of the other groups they want applicants to call and ask questions. They want to have that interaction.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really good advice.
I think in terms of clarity too, like being really clear about what you're asking for, just kind of a nuts and bolts way to help with that as well is just formatting. So I use, you know, Jane talked about using bold language, and I think using kind of bold formatting is a way to do that as well, where if you go through and like one of the questions, I just pulled up an old grant that for the South Dakota Arts Council, and one of the questions in the grant is, how does your work have potential to contribute to a higher standard for the arts in South Dakota? So to make sure that that answer isn't buried in the, you know, somewhere in the narrative in just some paragraph, I just have a bold heading that says how my work, you know, has the potential to contribute to a higher standard, blah, blah, blah. You know, so I just write that out, and then they know that's the answer is right after that. So then usually that breaks up the grant a little bit too, makes it a little bit easier to read, so you have a little bit less you know, eye and brain fatigue that, you know, that Jim was talking about. It's much easier to read a stack of those rather than you know, a novel. So I don't know.
Yeah, definitely. And I think those are good tips, Brian. Also, more and more grants are online portals, and sometimes they don't allow for as much formatting.
Mhm.
But there are similar things where just having a paragraph break and then just bang, here's what I'm going to answer next, and then another paragraph, or using a dash or an asterisk to create some bullet lists to help
Yeah,
provide some summarization.
yeah, just breaking up the space on a page too is great.
Yep. Well, to transition just a little bit away from the narrative, I wanted to start with you, Jane. You know, as you have reviewed so many different types of grants as well, what are some things that have been particularly helpful with work samples? You know, whether you're an organization or an artist, you know, most grants will ask you to demonstrate the quality of your work, you know, whether that's photos of past work if you're an individual visual artist, whether that's links to recordings or public performances, or if you're an organization, it's brochures for your programs. You know, is there anything in particular that you've noticed, wow, this was really helpful, or boy, this almost did more harm than good, or anything along those lines?
Well, one thing that does come to mind is I appreciate more current work samples. I know that we need some background history of your organization so that we understand its credibility and all, but I want to see, you know, I don't want to hear about things that happened 10 years ago as though that was, you know, what you're doing right now. So I think keeping it current, I guess I think I probably review more organizational grants. So just seeing that, you know, the variety of things that your organization does. And so a few real clear, current, diverse types of work samples that reflect your organization usually work for me.
Yeah, definitely. I think the other thing that I've run into as well is kind of wanting to have my work samples be, hey, here's everything we've ever done when I'm writing a grant specifically, say, for a professional development program. And they're like, great, we don't really care that you help publish a state arts magazine. We're only evaluating this grant based upon your professional development work. And so it's nice to provide a little bit of context if it's a program-based grant. If it's really talking about you as an entire organization, you want to have that variety, but keeping it to, you know, so for instance, if you're an individual artist and you're writing a grant for a poetry project, maybe you would want to focus on including your poetry work samples and not also that you're a sculptor and here's all of my sculptural work. You know, again, maybe it's good to have some variety, but you want to demonstrate that you can do the project that you have in front of you. You know, so Jim, maybe I would ask you only because, as you know, you've been involved in a lot of these panels, and as a musician, you know, you've also been around a lot of other art forms, but visual art, dance aren't necessarily your personal forte. So have you noticed anything as you've been evaluating artist grants in the past?
Yes. One thing, it's gotten a lot easier to share work samples over the last few years. I mean, I remember, I don't know, I guess maybe more than a few years, probably a decade or more, but when it used to be, you know, submit your audio file and it can't be more than 3 megs or something. So then you're trying to take, you know, a song that's 6 minutes and turn it into 30 seconds. And, you know, if it's a visual art piece, you got to have a certain dimensions. And a lot of that's gotten a lot better these days, which is good for artists. And especially when it comes to things online. I've really appreciated when an artist will share websites, YouTube videos, you know, anything that's sort of you know, replicates or gives a flavor of what the work will be. And to Jane's point, I think current is so important. I can't tell you how many times, you know, you read a grant and it's a work sample from 15 years ago and you think, well, what's been going on the last 15 years? You know, I mean, probably a lot of things, but that, you know, make sure you're updating those work samples. But you know, the types, I like to see real world. As music, for example, I think it's really great to see actual YouTube or even iPhone footage of a performance versus something highly polished, you know, produced kind of piece. Those are cool too, you know, but if it's a live performance situation, it's fun to see what that would be like, or it's, I think, more informative. I also have enjoyed when an artist, if it's a visual artist, gives like an artist talk or something. There have been some grants where they've been able to share a video of the artist talk. So you really feel like you get to know that artist versus just reading a statement or just seeing, you know, a two-dimensional piece of the work. You can see them actually interacting with you know, a gallery or an audience. And then I also wanted to echo one other, I guess it's a work sample. Some grants require them, others don't, but I do agree with what Brian said about letters of recommendation. Those are great. As someone that has reviewed a lot of grants, it really, they give you a sense of just, I don't know, they give you I think a different like it's like you're talking to a buddy then that said, oh, I've heard that artist. They're great. They're wonderful. I've been to his show, or I've seen her work. She's wonderful to work with. That letter gives you that kind of an insight to someone that really is willing to take the time. Anybody that's written letters of recommendation knows that, you're not just going to do that for anybody. So I think that does, you do get a different sense of the capability and the quality of work when you can read that kind of a letter from a colleague. So those are always good to see, but I still go back to websites, YouTube, anything online you can explore. Some grants won't let you do that. Some they have to be very specific examples. There's all sorts of criteria, but the more things that you can share from a slice of life, websites and concerts, YouTube, that kind of thing. I think today that's the way to go, because 20 years ago you couldn't do that, and so you can really open a lot more doors with the way technology works today as far as work samples go.
Just to jump in, that one thing that I've kind of noticed is a little bit of a theme on and off with all of these has been to talk about why you do what you do and not just what you do, because I think that very often, whether we're an individual artist trying to sound quote unquote professional, you're almost trying to be dispassionate, and your artist statement, so and so's name does this, great, and your work can be important, but I think it can be great, but why you do it, what drives you as an organization, as an artist. I mean, all these people on panels are in some way, shape, or form engaged in the arts, whether they're artists themselves or whether they're just passionate about it. And I think sharing that passion can be incredibly helpful to getting them excited, because when you're excited, this is why I do it. I do it to express myself. I do it to impact my community. I do it to do X, Y, and Z. It really helps, I think, to get the panelists to also feel that excitement.
Yeah.
Brian, I had a Q&A question came in that I think you could help with. Going back a little bit to the narrative side of things, with your experience as a copywriter, so many grants now have pretty strict word limits.
Mhm.
Do you have any tips and tricks for how to get your thoughts across in as concise of a time frame as possible, or how to prioritize what you include?
Yeah, I think well, my preference is always like tighter, punchier language in almost everything. So, and for me, like I start to as a panelist, I start to feel suspect if the language is too flowery. And I'm like, what? And I always think, like, what are you hiding? Like, that to me is like, if there's a lot of frosting on the language, then I think there's maybe not a lot of substance underneath it. And so, yeah, so I think just keeping it very, very, keeping the language simple and direct, and just making sure that that you really have that you're showing that you have an answer to these questions, and that you have a good reason, for the narrative. I think that I think like having a plan and making it clear that you have a plan for the money is like just one of the best. I mean, obviously next to the quality of work, I think that's going to be the most important thing, because I think, if two artists are equally talented, then the deciding factor is always going to be their plan, and making sure that it's well thought out, it's well articulated, because I feel like the better you can articulate that plan, like the more likely you're going to be able to execute on it if you've thought it through. So I think that's, and then in terms of just like from a writing and editing standpoint, I think just having someone, as I've said before, like take a look at it, and then because a dispassionate third party can look at it and say like, oh, you don't need this, or you're repeating stuff here. And so I think it's just pruning.
I think another thing that helps me with that writing part is to just start early.
Mhm.
And then when you start, write as much as you want for each of those answers when you're just drafting it. And then you come back to it and you go, man, that's way too much language there.
Yep.
And then you can distill it down. But if you're trying to write it at the last minute,
Yeah.
then it's you kind of skip that process of, okay, what really stands out in what I've written here, and how do I whittle it down to just what is needed. So take your time.
All great tips. So the last component of the grants that I wanted to get to, and Brian kind of started to address it in the last with the expression of having a plan, but what's helpful with the budget? I think that's the thing that often for especially individual artists, but even for organizations, can be one of the more difficult things to craft. Um, but maybe to set up the conversation, I was just going to say that I like how you said that what your budget kind of tells a story. I mean, your budget expresses what you're going to do and how you're going to use this money. They're ultimately funding organizations. It's not just it's not just a media trying to get excited to feature you for an interview. They're giving you money and they want to know what you're going to do with it. I guess I kind of throw it out collectively to the three of you, but do any of you have any particular advice on how to explain certain things in the budget, anything to avoid, anything to lean into?
Well, I'll jump in and just say two simple things, but one, make sure it adds up. You'd be surprised how often I've reviewed grants where you just get the calculator out and you realize, yeah, your budget doesn't add up. You didn't take the time to even do to add the lines together and make sure that you did your math right. So that's an easy one to be sure. That to me is a red flag, right away when you're like, oh, those lines don't add up like they're supposed to. That just is, seems to be a too something too simple that to miss. And then I think explaining within the narrative or especially more line items in to me is better than just big chunks of marketing 10,000. This is, I'm just making up numbers here, miscellaneous 5,000. That's just, you start to look at it and you go, well, wait, I don't get that. How are you going that doesn't, it's suspect. It doesn't seem like it's a well thought out plan, to Brian's point. So those are rather simple tips, but make sure your math actually adds up, and then explain your work, explain where those dollars are actually going.
And as someone who has a hard time making math add up in any context in my life, that's where it's a great opportunity to reach out to the organization as well and just say, because I did that a couple of grants ago where I just said, I reached out to someone with the organization. I said, "Can you tell me if did I do the budget right? Did I? Because it is. I mean, it is like a completely foreign language for someone like me. Like when I see a budget breakdown, like I break out in a sweat, and I need someone to tell me if what I'm writing down makes sense, or if I'm going to be thrown in jail. That's what I think."
I think the budget can be a really convincing part of your whole application if you use it correctly. And that's where I agree. Those budget notes are really helpful to the panelists because we can't interpret when you've probably gone to a lot of work to come up with those numbers. But if there's no interpretation, we're going to miss that whole point, where if you see it in the budget notes that this much for travel and then just delineate what, why, how you got to that number. It shows planning, it's convincing, it answers questions. And then I think another thing too is like Jim said, make sure it adds up, and then make sure you're consistent throughout the application. Sometimes the budget will say you're asking for this much, but on another page of the application, it has a different number. And maybe as you're working through things, those things change, but make sure you go through at the end and make sure the consistency is there.
I think the budget can be an exercise to help you to also help the artist think more strategically about their work. Just not even for that particular project, but just going forward. If you start creating line items in your head, even as you're working on something, then I think you can get a better understanding of like I said, not just the budget for the single project, but just kind of the value of your own time and your needs, for your work. And just like when you start thinking that way, then you can tell your story a little bit better as well.
That's a really good point, Brian, for pricing for, especially visual arts pieces or, even performers. There's so much that what's the stereotypical image of the iceberg. You only see this much above the water and there's this much below. But oftentimes as artists, we can feel odd about pricing ourselves because it feels strange. But when you realize like, yes, I only spent $250 on materials for this piece. So if I sell it for $325, I'm ahead. You're like, yeah, but you also put 125 hours into that painting. And so, now you're making 50 cents an hour in your labor, and you would never take a job that only paid that. And so, some of these budgeting exercises can help with that. And I think also the other thing I would mention is it goes back to the idea that not only do the panelists not know you, some of them are in the arts field, but maybe not in your very specific discipline. And so, here's a personal example. I got an ask from someone that was sitting on a panel because there was a professional musician involved in a symphonic orchestra that was writing a grant towards partially purchase of a new instrument, and they were like, "Is this number make sense to you? Like they're saying it's going to cost this much to buy this instrument." And, to someone or like if you're a sculptor and you're saying you need how much in clay to do your work, it's like, yeah, so being able to, if your supply line says this very large number, this very large portion of the grant, you might want to just remind the panel, this is exactly why I need this much and it costs me this much per pound to get, and I need this much to do these two projects, and just help provide that context.
The few words I wrote down when I was thinking about the standards: don't leave me wondering if I'm a grant panelist. So if there's anything in there that you think might confuse somebody, don't leave it that way. Try your best to clarify. And I just want to also comment on Brian's point. The budgets are super confusing, and seems like every foundation has a different way of describing expense, versus revenue and how that works. So yeah, that doesn't, and a lot of times it doesn't jive with normal business practices either. So even if you're really up to speed on the typical accounting procedures, sometimes it doesn't work that way with a foundation. They don't even use the same terminology. So making that call is, I think, essential if there's any confusion.
A question that came in based around budget, and some of these questions are ones that will have to be asked of the particular granting organizations you're going to, because they're all just a little bit different. Oh, yeah, he's real excited. But one question is from Jen. How does one put how they recover expenses that are above the amount being requested in the grant? So, for example, if you're an individual artist, and you have a project that's going to cost X amount of dollars, and the grant you're writing is only going to cover 25% of it. How do you help demonstrate that you have a plan for that whole budget, even if you're only writing a grant for part of it? The first thing I'll say quickly is just double check with the granting organization, only because some of them might say, we only want to know what you're doing with our money. We forbid you from telling us what you're doing with the rest of the project. We only want to know what you're doing with this little bit. But generally speaking, do any of you have some tips on kind of how to tell that large story if you're writing for just a small portion of it?
I think you can say in the narrative maybe that when you're saying what the grant funds will be used for, I think you can just slip in a line to, if the rest of it is out of pocket or whatever, or if you can get specific about. I think like if it is part of a larger project, then if you can find a distinct quadrant of that project that that grant can go towards specifically. I received a grant from the Sioux Falls Arts Council last year, and it was for a short film that I'm working on, but it was specifically for, I applied for the grant specifically for the production design. So it was paying a sculptor to create a mask for this project. And so So it was helpful in two ways. One, it was basically saying like the Sioux Falls Arts Council pays for this very tangible part of the project, this part of the film that's on screen that can be paid for by the Council. But then it also, but the other benefit too was that it was that money I was taking grant money from the Arts Council to give to another artist, and so that was kind of a way and I the feedback I got from the council was that that was great because they were essentially then serving two artists. And so obviously these organizations, they would like to give every artist money, but funds are tight. So I think if you can find ways within your grant to multiply the impact that your project will have, so it isn't even just benefiting you, but it's also benefiting other artists, that's great. So I think if you can, so if you can find ways to specifically say this is exactly what your money is going to in this larger production, whatever that is, and then also it isn't just then if you and then just find ways to multiply it, like how can they, because I think that's just going to be attractive to any organization and any panel if they can do more with less.
Definitely.
Some
Well,
organizations may even let you, especially on an organizational grant, maybe submit your sort of a supplement or another attachment that just shows here's the full project budget and here's where your percentage or your part of that project comes to play. Some may not want you to do that, like Andrew mentioned, but if that is allowed, it certainly as a reviewer, it's great to see the big picture and be able to go, oh, okay, I see how this all fits. I see the
And
puzzle here.
sometimes on the organizational level, then you can show like we plan, we're going to partner with other organizations, and whenever you see that collaboration, that's a real strong element too to show that something's going to get done.
The last thing on the budget I would mention around that, which actually came up with our Q&A session with the Arts Council specifically, which actually is a question just popped in as I was starting to talk that is sort of about this. So the question is, if the grant is for matching funds, do you say who or what organization will cover the match? Do you need to know how it will be matched ahead of time? Yes, but you need to just know what your plan is to get the matching funds by the end of the grant. You need to be able to demonstrate that there was a match. So you want a plan in place for how that will be covered. But for instance, if you're saying as an organization, if you're saying we will raise $1,000 in individual donations, you don't necessarily have to have that money raised already. You just have to know that this is your plan to raise this money. Or if you're an individual artist, what I was going to mention before this question popped in, the Arts Council brought up last week or 2 weeks ago, selling your work and making money from selling the work can be a match for many organizations, the Arts Council included. So if you have to match it, if you're going to sell your piece of visual art, your story, whatever that is, that can be the match. And so, really, again, reach out to the staff to have those conversations. But what they want to see is at the end of the day, the last thing any granting organization wants to do is take your money back. Just for a lot of reasons. The paperwork headache is only one of them, but mostly it's they want to support arts and artists. And so, what they really want to be able to see though is for the State Arts Council, for instance, they have requirements on them based on the funding they get from the NEA. And so they have to show that this money was matched. And so if you don't have that matching funding, sometimes you can be ineligible for a certain portion of the money that they gave you. And so just reaching out to kind of confirm, but really it's just they want to see you have a plan, and then that'll shift a little bit. I know as an organization, for us, sometimes we say, hey, we're going to get this much in corporate sponsorships, and we didn't quite make that goal, but we were able to get more in individual donations. And so it all evens out at the end of the day, but just having that plan is important on the grant application. Well, I kind of can't believe it, but it's already been basically an hour. It's been, so great to have this conversation. But really quickly before we sign off, any last thoughts? Any other quick things that come to mind that you were really burning to make sure to mention today?
nothing more than's been said. I think so much good advice here. And I think bottom line though is that, there are a lot of people that want to support your work. A lot of foundations are excited to do that, and so they want reasons to partner with you. So, don't. I think coming from it with that perspective, coming up to the project, to the grant with that perspective of let's partner together, is a good attitude to have. And you don't need to be. I think the other thing that intimidated me at first was I'm not a grant writer. I'm not trained to be. I'm not a grant writer, or you don't have to be. I think, in fact, sometimes it's better if you're not in some situations. So it's all the other advice, though, probably most importantly, reach out to the Arts Council, to the funder, and have a conversation. Say, how can I best give me some tips, give me some advice, give me some information on how to do this well. Don't be afraid to make that call. That's what they're there for. That's their job. So they're always willing to have that conversation. And I know that starts right away with the South Dakota Arts Council. You can pick up the phone and they're waiting to talk to you.
And consider being a panelist sometime.
Yeah. Oh, that's great.
It's a really wonderful experience, and it's inspiring. You get a chance to just experience that passion that people have for creating art and for enhancing their communities. So yeah, I strongly recommend it.
And it'll make you a better grant writer too.
You can appreciate the process on both sides, and you can better understand granting organizations as well and their work. So.
And I do know the Arts Council takes volunteers. They request volunteers. It's not just invitation. They want folks from a wide variety of arts disciplines and experience to volunteer to be a panelist. So definitely check their website and consider volunteering for that as well. Well, great. Well, thank you all so much. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Jim. It's been, the thank yous are pouring in the chat. And so we're really excited to see quick response. This has been helpful. We will send a recording of today's session out by the end of the week. So you'll be able to go back through, rewatch any portions that you wanted to get some more notes from. And please reach out to any of us at Art South Dakota at any time if we can be of service to you and your work. And also if you have any ideas for future sessions, any burning questions you would love to see some more information on. So thank you all so much again, and thanks again to our three panelists. I wish, normally if we were in person, this would be where we do the round of applause again. So we'll do the kind of, the virtual round of applause. But thank you all again for your time today, and thank you everyone watching for everything you're doing to help keep South Dakota creative. So thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
See you later. Thank you.